Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're jumping right into some really interesting audio. It's from a recent meeting between the former U.S. president and the Canadian Prime Minister.
That's right. And our goal here, our mission for this deep dive, is really to unpack it. We want to pull out the key insights, the important bits, covering everything from, well, trade to international relations.
And even some, let's say, surprising personal opinions that came up.
Exactly. So you, the listener, should get a really quick but thorough feel for the dynamics here, and maybe some perspectives you weren't expecting.
Okay, so let's get into it. The recording kicks off with, the usual opening pleasantries, and right away there are congratulations for the Canadian PM on winning his recent election.
Yeah, and what's kind of interesting there is the former president immediately draws this parallel to his own political comeback story, how the PM's party came from behind.
A bit of a personal touch right at the start. And then they chat a little about the Oval Office. It's described as new and improved, maybe with some 24-karat gold elements. That detail stood out.
A unique touch, yeah. And also talk about looking at old photos, historical ones from the White House vaults.
So a fairly light start, but it shifts pretty quickly to more serious global issues. Ukraine and Russia come up first.
Right. And on that, they both basically say they want to see the war end soon, a shared desire there.
It's a broad statement, of course, but it does show, a point of agreement at that high level.
Even if the how might be different down the line.
Then something pretty unexpected happens, like breaking news during the meeting itself.
Yeah, this was wild. Apparently, word comes through that the Houthis have just told the U.S. side they, quote, don't want to fight anymore.
Whoa. Okay, so what does that mean, according to the conversation?
Well, the immediate take is this could mean the U.S. stops bombing in the area and the Houthis commit to stopping attacks on ships.
Which connects back to the whole freedom of navigation point they mentioned.
Exactly. If that holds, and it's a big if maybe, but it could really change things in that region.
Okay, so after that surprise, the focus shifts. The former president mentions an upcoming trip to the Middle East.
Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar are on the list.
And this is where it gets really interesting. He hints pretty strongly at a very, very big announcement coming just before that trip.
Yeah, he says Thursday, Friday, or maybe the following Monday, and describes it as possibly one of the most important announcements in years. Very significant subject.
But no details on what it actually is.
Nope, just building that anticipation. Leaves you wondering, right?
Definitely. So then the Canadian Prime Minister gets his turn to speak, offers his remarks.
And he expresses thanks for the hospitality, the leadership, standard diplomatic stuff.
But his focus gives us a sense of Canada's priorities. He mentions the economy, borders, the fentanyl crisis, which is huge, and general security.
It's interesting how those mirror a lot of U.S. domestic concerns, too. Shared challenges, clearly.
And he makes a point of stressing the long history of U.S.-Canada cooperation, reaffirms that commitment to working together.
Which kind of sets the stage, doesn't it, for the trade talks that follow?
It does. And that brings them straight to USMCA, the deal that replaced NAFTA. Someone basically asked, is USMCA dead?
And the answer given is, that it's been very effective, but there have been issues with everyone actually sticking to the terms. Adherence problems.
It's framed as like a necessary step up from NAFTA, which he, again, really criticizes heavily.
Right. And he also floats the idea that USMCA itself might need renegotiating down the road.
So not necessarily set in stone, even though it's seen as an improvement.
It seems that way. It suggests a more, let's say, fluid approach to these trade deals. Things could change.
Then there's a question about whether his first trade deal might be with Canada.
Yeah.
And the answer is pretty positive.
Yeah. It says yes. Mentions respect for the Prime Minister, suggests something could happen.
That's quite a warm tone, especially given some of the tough talk on trade generally.
It is. But then the next question is a bit of a curveball, maybe? What's the top concession he wants from Canada?
And the answer isn't tariffs or market access.
Right.
It's friendship.
Right, friendship. Followed by saying, again, how Canada is a very special place.
Brings up family ties, even mentions Wayne Gretzky, trying to frame it personally.
Definitely trying to soften the edges there, frame it less transactionally.
But almost in the next breath, the old idea of Canada becoming the 51st state comes up again.
Yeah, he says he still believes in that idea and lays out the supposed benefits for Canadians: huge tax cuts, free U.S. military protection, medical care.
And he frames it from his, real estate developer background. Like, why have this artificially drawn line dividing things.
Seeing it more as one integrated economic space.
How does the Prime Minister react to that?
Politely but very firmly pushes back. Says Canada is not for sale. End of story.
No ambiguity there.
None. The focus, he says, is on partnership, not acquisition.
Okay. Then the conversation moves to Canada's military spending.
And there's an acknowledgement that Canada is committed to spending more on security, that they are stepping up their military role.
Which probably relates to those ongoing NATO discussions about defense budgets, right?
But very likely. Burden sharing is always a topic there.
Then they shift to economic specifics, the auto industry and energy.
Right. A shared interest in protecting the car business in both countries.
And the energy part is interesting, too. He contrasts the energy abundance in North America, U.S. and Canada, with China's situation.
Positioning it as a major strategic advantage for North America.
And that leads directly into talking about China trade.
Yep. The former president claims China wants a meeting and says trade between the U.S. and China is way down.
He throws out a big number, claiming the U.S. used to lose $1 trillion in trade with China and is now saving that because of the current situation.
He attributes this saving directly to the high tariffs imposed on Chinese goods. The perspective presented is that these tariffs are really hurting China's economy.
Following that, he makes a pretty bold claim about companies moving to the U.S.
Yeah, he says a massive number are relocating. Cites Honda specifically, and mentions potential total investments in the range of $9 or even $10 trillion.
Wow. And again, he links this directly to the tariffs making the U.S. more attractive.
That's the argument presented. Tariffs make it expensive to import, so companies choose to build and invest in the U.S. instead. This is then contrasted with criticism of the previous administration's policies, especially on immigration.
He names Apple and a chip maker as examples of companies making big U.S. investments.
Concrete examples to back up the claim.
Then the conversation kind of shifts philosophy a bit. It's about the approach to trade, less about signing lots of formal deals.
Exactly. The view expressed is that you don't necessarily need tons of complex agreements. It's more about setting the terms, setting fair numbers, basically, the price for other countries to access the U.S. market.
He uses that analogy, doesn't he? The U.S. is a super luxury store.
Yeah, implying you have to pay a premium to sell your goods there. But also, he says, the U.S. will push other countries to open their markets and drop their tariffs too.
Mentions India as an example of a country that supposedly agreed to this.
Right. The whole underlying theme is this feeling that the U.S. has been, quote, ripped off for decades, and this new approach is meant to stop that.
Got it. Now, there's a quick clarification that pops up regarding that Houthi news from earlier.
Oh, right. He makes sure to say it wasn't a deal the U.S. made, but rather a statement from the Houthis themselves.
Clarifying the source of the information.
Yeah, and he mentions getting it from a very good source, adding a bit of weight to it, even without naming the source.
Okay, back to USMCA for a moment. Is there talk about specific changes to it in the future?
It's discussed briefly. The perspective seems to be that USMCA is like a starting point for broader talks. And yeah, some parts might need tweaking over time.
And it's mentioned that the tariffs currently in place have kind of operated within the USMCA framework anyway.
Sort of alongside it or using aspects of it, suggesting the policies and the agreement are interacting.
Then the discussion touches on a hypothetical. What if Canada decided to trade less with the U.S. and more with other countries?
The reaction to that idea is, well, pretty assertive.
That's it.
The claim made is basically that from the U.S. perspective, they don't do that much business with Canada, but Canada relies heavily on trade with the U.S., kind of minimizing Canada's leverage.
Interesting framing.
And then there's a pivot to U.S. military strength, claiming the U.S. has the best military equipment in the world, which Canada buys. And he adds an anecdote about military gear left in Afghanistan, and another about defeating ISIS quickly, seemingly to underscore U.S. power.
Right, projecting strength. Okay, what about the economic impact of those claimed investments? Is there a timeline mentioned?
The answer given is basically right now, that the impact is immediate, especially with AI projects supposedly already starting.
So not something that takes years to show up in the data.
That's the assertion. And a distinction is drawn between these supposedly private investments and big government projects that need lots of funding and approvals.
And this leads to some criticism of things like the CPS Act.
Yeah, the CPS Act gets criticized. The claim is it just gave money to rich companies without guarantees and included woke requirements, specifically mentioning DEI.
Okay. And there are anecdotes used to illustrate problems with those kinds of requirements.
Right. Raven mentions President Obama's library construction facing issues, allegedly due to DEI, and the California high-speed rail project as, like, a disaster of cost overruns and mismanagement,
Right.
linking it back to similar principles. Again, just reporting the perspective shared in the audio here.
Understood. So circling back one more time to potential USMCA changes. Anything specific mentioned?
Not really specific clauses. It's more like maybe some subtle changes could be looked at, but the focus seems broader on the overall trade concepts.
And the existing tariffs are brought up again. Cars, steel, aluminum.
Yes, those are mentioned, along with the arrangement made under USMCA about automotive parts sourcing.
Then comes a very, very direct question for the former president.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything the Canadian Prime Minister could say or offer that would make him lift the tariffs on Canada?
And the answer is just no.
Flat out no.
Flat out no, followed by just the way it is.
Wow.
Although there's a small caveat added, like maybe over time, if Canadians really wanted it, he might respect their wishes. But the immediate answer is no.
Okay, so how does the Canadian PM respond to this ongoing tariff situation in his remarks?
Well, he, again, respectfully disagrees with the whole 51st state idea first.
Right.
And then he emphasizes that Canada is actually the largest customer of the United States. Pushes back on that earlier framing.
Highlighting the scale of the relationship from Canada's side.
Exactly, and points to how integrated the auto sector is. Says a huge percentage of the parts and cars assembled in Canada actually come from the U.S.
So the tariffs hurt U.S. suppliers, too, is the implication.
That seems to be the point. He suggests this whole tariff thing is part of a much bigger, more complex picture.
So how does the conversation on U.S.-Canada trade wrap up? What's the final tone?
It's described as a very friendly discussion, but clearly with different goals.
Friendly disagreement.
Pretty much. The former president reiterates the desire for the U.S. to make its own cars, steel, aluminum, brings up the idea of a trade deficit with Canada, again, questioning if the U.S. is subsidizing Canada.
Yeah, and there's another anecdote shared.
Yeah, about jokingly calling the Prime Minister Governor Trudeau once, and recalling a past conversation where he apparently told the PM that a 25% tariff on cars would be the end of Canada.
Strong words.
Very strong, but then almost paradoxically reaffirms the commitment to Canada's military defense while still questioning the economic balance. It's a complex mix.
Absolutely. So as we finish up this deep dive, we've really covered a lot of ground. Trade talks, USMCA, China, Canada. That surprising Houthi development, hints of a major announcement, different economic viewpoints, diplomatic nuances.
For sure. And some really memorable moments stick out, don't they? That Houthi news just dropping in, the whole 51st state comment popping up again, and that super luxury store analogy for the U.S. market, quite a way to frame trade policy.
It really makes you think, what part of this stood out most to you, listening in? And what might the longer-term consequences of these talks actually be for both countries, and maybe globally, too?
Definitely food for thought. Hopefully this gave you a good sense of the conversation.
We certainly encourage you to dig deeper into any aspect that caught your interest. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.